Hello everyone. Welcome to another Eurogenç TV program. The mission of our programs at Eurogenç TV is to inform, enlighten, and raise awareness, and hope that through this process, our community will be encouraged to tackle some of the difficult issues prevalent in our community. Racism, sexism, homophobia are among those issues. We have had a number of programs on racism following the murder of George Floyd in America. Tonight, we are going to talk about sexism and homophobia with my wonderfully knowledgeable guests. Welcome to the program, my dear friends.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Ertanc.
I hope you are all okay.
We are.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Good, good. Especially Filiz outside, I can see.
Yep. And not in the UK.
Not in the UK, yes. I didn't want to say that, but you said it. That's fine. Yes, I know all of you. Obviously, we've worked together in a number of ways, and but I wonder if you can say a couple of words introducing yourselves to our viewers. Filiz, can I start with you?
Yep. So my name's Filiz, and I'm a child protection social worker. I'm in senior management in a East London borough, and I've been in the profession now 20 plus years.
Right, good. And obviously before that, we were together at the TYA,
Yeah.
Turkish Youth Association.
And before that, I was a sexual health worker, actually, and a youth worker at the TYA, which
Yes,
gave me the interest in social work.
yeah, okay. Aisha?
Yes, I'm Aisha Gül. I started off as a teacher, but then I went into equalities within a year or so. Initially race equality, and then subsequently women's equality. And after that, I was the manager of a women's equality unit. Whilst there, I was seconded to lead across the council on performance appraisal. So my role kind of went into training and development.
Right, and of course, you and I were together at the TEG, Turkish Education Group, for
That's
some
right,
time.
yes. And we
Wonderful.
for a while, we were together in Haringey Council as well, in the same department.
Absolutely, absolutely. Talking about Haringey Council, we've got wonderful Councillor Peray Ahmet. Hello, Peray.
Hello, hi. So I'm Peray Ahmet. I'm a Labour councillor in the London Borough of Haringey. I'm also, so my day job is similar to Fevzi, who I think is going to join us later. I'm a branch secretary, so a full-time trade union rep for Unison as well as part of my day job. So a councillor and a trade union rep.
And of course, you and I were on the EMJCC board on Haringey Council, representing the Turkish Cypriot community. So as you can see, dear viewers, we've got three very appropriate people to talk about these issues. Let's start with definitions, because I think most of the time these definitions are quite interchangeably used and sometimes not very correctly. For example, the discrimination, prejudice, discrimination are used very interchangeably, but they mean different things, don't they? Prejudice is thought, whereas discrimination is acting on the thought. So, and discrimination involves power. So in terms of these issues like sexism and homophobia, there are a lot of what we call jargons the local authorities and government departments use. So, for example, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, LGBT, and many other terms. So, in terms of sexism, what is the simple definition of sexism? Anyone who wants to start?
Okay, I'll go first. Sexism, a sort of a broad definition, if you like, is viewing women as somehow inferior or not equal to men, attributing certain social roles, social expectations. It's also about sort of projecting images of women as sexual objects. For instance, the page 3 girl that for decades appeared in the Sun newspaper. Prior to that, there was also a similar page in the Mirror, but the Mirror sort of gave it up long before the Sun. And it sort of can lead into misogynistic behavior, which is, if you like, sort of more serious and potentially more dangerous and more discriminatory towards women. The basic definition is hatred of women, but a lot of misogynists aren't actually aware that their behavior is based on a hatred of women. But it projects itself in being very antagonistic or rude towards women. I mean, I personally had experiences on Facebook on sort of political groups where I've challenged the terminology used by men. And some of them have got really nasty, you know. And you
Aisha,
can just...
we'll come to the experiences later on in the program. So which will be quite interesting to hear from you about your own personal experiences.
Okay.
But in terms of homophobia and transphobia, what are
homophobia is basically, I mean, a phobia, the sort of definition of phobia really is a fear. And this fear lends itself to hatred and discrimination or bullying, and basically excluding from certain roles or certain, you know, social groups, people who are gay or lesbian. Biphobia, I would say, is actually phobia or discrimination or hatred towards people who are bisexual. Transphobia is people who are transgender, whether they've actually had an operation or they haven't had an operation, treating them with you know, lack of respect, and making fun, victimizing, or socially excluding, I would say is transphobic behavior. I'm quite happy for others to add their definitions.
Yeah. Thanks, Aisha. Peray and Filiz, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just, I mean, I don't think there's much to add to what Aisha has already said, but in terms of the different types and the way this kind of manifests, so you've obviously got institutional, the way this is institutional, deeply embedded, indirect, structural, that type of thing versus the kind of direct. And I think often, you know, my experience is mainly with local authority, local government. Perhaps it's not as direct as it may have once been, but it's that kind of deeply institutionalized, which I'm sure we'll get onto at some point, you know, so how that kind of different treatment manifests in terms of opportunities and you know, what we've got on offer for us as women, etc.
Yeah.
But I will also, and we will get onto it, is about intersectionality. So again, we talk about all of these things as separate things, but they're not separate, are they? You know, so
no, it's
you're a
all
woman,
interconnected.
a person of colour, whether you're disabled, you know, these are all interconnected. Working class, you know. So I think intersectionality is something we definitely need to talk more about as well.
Filiz, when Aisha talked about sexism, she quite rightly said treating women in an inferior way, which is absolutely right. But sexism is, in fact, treating either sex. But in actual fact, sexism is aimed 99.9% towards women, isn't it? But I think sometimes these terms are used to water down equalities inequalities, in my opinion. For example, when people say sex equality, sex discrimination, and so on, they mean inequality or women discriminating against women and so on, isn't it?
Definitely, and the social justice and criminal justice system is also sexist, mainly against women. So in the field that I work in, where there's domestic violence, the impact is mainly on the woman. But we also, when we're providing service, have to think about providing a service where it also provides it to victims that are men as well. So we still have to think about it that way. And I think in my social work, with my social work hat, is I also have to think about the role of the father as well, and not with the traditional roles, because we have a lot of fathers that work who do kind of what we traditionally would think women would do as mothers. So as a social worker, you have to think with those values. Most of us will have those values attached in some way, and the families we work with will have those values attached, but you have to kind of help people think out of the box a little bit.
Yeah, and the other thing is, when we talk about these issues, we also mean in terms of harassment, victimization, bullying, and all sorts of other things in connection with, when we say discrimination and prejudice, acting out the prejudice. Sometimes, I think it was Peray who said they manifest themselves in misogynistic behavior and harassment and so on. So, I mean, and let's throw another term into the mix, feminism and relationship between sexism. What is the relationship between feminism and sexism?
Well, I would say that feminism came about because we had centuries of disadvantage, women being disadvantaged in society and being treated less favorably than men. I mean, in Britain, in previous centuries, once a woman got married, all her property, became her husband's property. And women, therefore, were very vulnerable. However rich they might have been, they were very vulnerable to mistreatment by husbands who might have just wanted to marry them for their, for their fortune. So I would say that just as socialism came about because we had the exploitation of the working class, feminism came about because we had the exploitation of women. And I would say, just as socialism is having an awareness of class and privilege and how that impacts on working classes, I would say that feminism is having a gender perspective. And sort of being aware of the different ways, directly and indirectly, of how women are disadvantaged or have been disadvantaged, and trying to come up with innovative ways of redressing that disadvantage, and trying to educate both men and women so that they are more aware, and so that we can, move forward collectively. I mean, I know this is going to be a subject further down where we're going to look at the role of men. But I would say that, we can draw parallels with, class politics and race politics as well.
Okay. Anything to add to this, Filiz and Peray?
Well, feminism is the strive for equality, but
I think
what's interesting to kind of, sorry, Filiz, was you sorry, I could sort of interfere, but
no, that's all right, that's okay.
Sorry, you want to go? No, so I think the difficulty is it's the different types of feminisms again. So we've got feminism's come in different waves over many years. I think it's worth considering nowadays how popular it is to call oneself a feminist. I mean, I'll proudly call myself a feminist, but how do a lot of the younger women feel about this as well? And also the different types, because because sometimes, yeah, there's feminism, but is it a feminism that's relevant to all women? And over time, we've had, you know, black women and women of colour who fight and say, well, actually, that's a white feminism. So I think it's an all-encompassing term, but, you know, it can be broken down and looked at in many ways for its relevance. So, you know, I'm a proud feminist, but how popular is the term nowadays? I don't know. I don't speak to many young women. Maybe Filiz will know. I don't know.
I suppose it's how the media have also portrayed. Yeah, it's about how the media have portrayed it.
So I hope it will be.
Well, let's keep going.
You speak among yourself until we can sort this out. Yeah. Maybe I have to come out and.
But that's right, Peray. It's about how different.
Okay.
So about generation. It goes back to how different generations.
The other question I wanted to ask was about the laws prohibiting discrimination on the grounds of sex and sexuality, how effective they are.
Ertanc, can you hear us?
If you start discussing, I'll come out and connect again in the meantime. Okay.
Filiz, maybe finish what you were saying.
Maybe I should. I was just saying that it's the same as what you're both saying. It's generational about what the cause of feminism might be for different generations, and also what it might be in the different class levels as well. Yeah. All right, good. So I think if you spoke to a young woman a younger person about what feminism would mean, we'd get different definitions and different focus and perspective about it. Because they know they have got rights to own property, and they have got rights to vote, and they have got rights to choose most professions that they can, and they may have. Most young women would see themselves having those opportunities, not all of them, of course, but and so they would see it as having different rights to be able to do what they want. So if I talk about my own daughter, it would be about what she wears as she walks out the door. And I would be questioning and judging what she's wearing as she's walking out the door. And then she would say, but I can wear what I want. And that's about people shouldn't be judging me about how I'm dressed, etc. And that would be linked to sexism for her.
Yeah. The question I wanted to ask was about how effective is the laws prohibiting these discrimination on the grounds of sex and sexuality. For example, as we all know, there used to be different discrimination acts, Sex Discrimination Act, Race Discrimination Act, and so on. And in 2010, they unified them and brought out the Equalities Act, Equalities and Human Rights Act, I think. And do you think by doing that, it watered down the effectiveness of race and sex and disability discrimination, for example? How do you think it affected the various legislation prohibiting discrimination on those grounds? What has been your experience?
Well, I would say that up until the end of this year, I suppose we were protected by European legislation with regard to human rights, the Supreme Court on Human Rights, etc. A recent experience has been with regard to discrimination against people with disabilities. For instance, with the universal credit, a number of people with disabilities have had their benefits stopped, and they've had to apply to tribunals. There was also a recent expose of discrimination against people with disabilities within the Department of Work and Pensions. And interestingly enough, the Department of Work and Pensions has lost more cases at tribunal than any other employer. So, I mean, I know when I was actually engaged full time in terms of my professional work within equalities. The disability legislation came out in 1995, whereas Equal Pay Act was 1970, sex discrimination 1974, race discrimination 1975, etc. And then obviously a lot of councils, thanks to the GLC, were also taking very proactive steps in terms of sexuality, and a number of councils, introduced, they sort of developed, implemented policies and recruited staff to ensure that council departments, etc., were not discriminating against people on grounds of sexuality. Unfortunately, Mrs. Thatcher then brought out legislation to prevent any sort of positive portrayal of whether in schools, sort of preventing teachers from using more positive material with regard to sexuality and different types of family, etc. I don't know. I mean, Peray is more closely involved with local authorities currently. I know in the 80s and 90s there was significant progress with regard to race equality and sex equality. However, unfortunately, institutional racism is still not a thing of the past. I don't know what the latest figures are with regard to gender equality, but what I do know is there are still women are still underrepresented in terms of senior management, and of course there was the experience within the BBC just last year, where we discovered that female presenters were being paid less than male presenters, despite legislation of with regard to equal pay. I mean, in my day, in the 1980s, we were actually pushing forward as a women's equality unit, equal pay for work of equal value. So it wasn't just an issue of being paid, the same money if you were doing the same work, but if the job was of equal value, we pushed that with the support of the trade unions to improve, the payment of women across the council.
So I think when they introduced the single equalities legislation, for example, before we used to have the CRE, we used to have the Women's Equality Commission and Disability Commission and so on. Do you think by getting rid of those separate commissions, the equalities in different areas have suffered?
I think it's maybe diluted things a little bit. And obviously they've had their resources cut as well.
Absolutely.
The Equalities Commission and the Commission for Racial Equality. So local authorities have done the same thing. I mean, as Filiz and Peray will I'm sure they will sort of expand on what I've said. I mean, it happened during my time, in fact, because of cuts, because the central government was cutting the rate support grant to local authorities. They had to shed thousands of staff. And inevitably, they had to focus on those services that they had to provide by law. And so consequently, women's equality units, race equality units were, they were restructured into one body. So staff would have to look at equalities as a whole, rather than just focusing on one or focusing on disability, etc. So obviously, Peray is more up to date, and so is Filiz.
Peray and Filiz, what about all these mainstreaming was supposed to be to make sure that all parts of the councils tackle the inequalities issues. But has that worked in practice? Peray?
Well, I think you just have to look at the evidence, don't you? I mean, we can debate legislation until the cows come home, but how many female chief executives
Yes.
do you see? How many female leaders of councils do you see? I mean, it's there in front of you. And even when you do get female chief executives, for those of us who've worked in local government, they tend to be white women. I don't think I've ever seen a black woman.
Got one in Newham.
Have you? There you go.
Yeah,
Bravo.
got one in Newham.
But I think your area is fascinating. As I said, I'm a trade union rep in local government as well as a councillor in a different borough, obviously. But Filiz, you know, take social work, for example, predominantly black women, predominantly. I'm sure your borough is the same in East London. How many black female directors do you see? I mean, Haringey has one. Does any of the others? So that's just the evidence right there. You know, it's anecdotal, but it's clear to see. So, and that's in local government. I hate to think about the private sector, which actually surprisingly sometimes is better, but it's obvious. I mean, when women do come through, it tends to be white women, you know. So I think it's clear that there's still a long way to go in terms of actually getting, you know, that the glass ceiling. That's what we call it. It's the glass ceiling. Getting women to break through that glass ceiling is still a way to go. I'm sure it's improved. I'm told it's improved. I'm told by people older than me it was worse. You should have been there back in the day. You would have been asked to make a cup of tea. You know, but I don't get asked to make a cup of tea, but it's still a struggle to get where I am. So,
I mean, there still has to be a number of initiatives that are created to enable that anyway. So there's always initiatives for black and ethnic minority staff in their leadership programs, or there's or other kind of mentorships or coaching involved to support that. And you will get that in some parts of the private sector, but not a lot. But that's a kind of positive action, but not positive discrimination.
But Filiz, I want to say something about that. And I tell you what, because you always hear that, you always hear mentoring and all of this, but sometimes it's not, you know, and what that does is that ignores institutional racism. I tell you why, because it presumes that you need the mentoring or you need the extra support. Sometimes
I agree.
Sometimes it's not that. Sometimes literally you're blocked because when you're sat in front of an interview panel, nobody on that interview panel looks and sounds like you, and you can have as much mentoring as possible. But actually, if they're not willing to give you that opportunity based on your merit, and let's be honest, we all know people who on merit should have gone a lot further, haven't, due to their gender or their race or whatever reason. So I think I agree with you. I think mentoring and, you know, all these programs are great, you know, but actually institutional racism and sexism and, you know, classism even, you know, that's one we
all three,
you know, absolutely needs to be shattered before we can get anywhere. You know, I think that the other stuff, the training, mentors, etc., I think it's a way for people to just pat themselves on the back and say, well, we're trying, but none are coming through. We are trying, you know. So anyway, that's a bit of a kind of radical thing to say, I guess, but you know, that's
Peray, you are
I don't think it's radical. I think it's very realistic.
No, I think it's fair and realistic.
Very realistic. I mean, you know, in the 80s and 90s, I'm sorry I keep harping back, but in you know, in some ways that was a fantastic time to be involved in developing exciting community initiatives and you know, initiatives within the council. There was funding. I mean, unfortunately, it all goes back to money. There was far more resources for training and development within councils. I mean, I remember going on the training course for, you know, for interviewers. It was a 3-day course, and it explored things like cloning. You know, when you sort of mention this to sort of people who haven't worked in, you know, those kinds of structures, they say, well, what is cloning? They, you know, we know about cloning sheep and so on. But it's what goes back to what Peray was saying, that people on interviewing panels subconsciously are looking for people who are like them. that they can understand. And this is why people from, you know, working class backgrounds, different black and minority ethnic backgrounds, people who may be gay or bisexual or transgender or women still often lose out, because there aren't people that reflect those issues or that awareness on the panel. And I think it is a resources issue as much as anything else. There might be the will within the council, but if they haven't got the resources to implement these policies, it's not going to happen. And of course, with COVID now, resources are going to be even more scant.
So being devil's advocate, if all that existed in the 80s, why didn't it create change? Why didn't we have that difference?
Because Thatcher came in. Thatcher came in and started cutting, you know, the resources of local government, well, you know, were cut by millions and millions every year. And they're continuing to be cut by billions. So, you know, there might be this kind of desire or willingness, but if you haven't got the resources, I mean, fast tracking, for instance, in the 90s, I'm sure you remember when we were on the EMJCC Ertanc, there was a project to fast track BNM, you know, members of black and minority communities who were staff, council employees. And we managed to get, you know, a few Turkish Cypriots, you know, fast tracked into management training. But it requires resources. You know, people could go and do a master's. You know, they could go off and train as social workers, and they would be given the time off. They would be given the funding. They could go off and do a course to become, you know, sort of highly qualified human resources.
There were a lot of innovative programs. I mean, when I was in Islington Race Equalities Department, we've had a lot of innovative programs, but I think the other major factor was the fact that the third sector has been decimated. I mean, there has been excellent third sector organizations advocating, sort of fighting for equalities, LGBT equalities or sex equalities, race equality. But where are they now? You mentioned EMJCC. You and I were the EMJCC reps, and then I dragged Peray into being the other EMJCC rep as well. Do they exist anymore, Peray, in Haringey?
What does it stand for?
Ethnic Minority Joint Consultative Committee.
Right. So probably nothing like that.
We had representatives from major communities on the board, and we used to have regular meetings with the councillors, chaired by the leader of the council, which was quite influential, wasn't it, Peray?
It was, and you know, as Shigul keeps saying, I mean, one of the biggest issues has been the government cuts. I mean, Filiz works in social work. That's a protected area. It's statutory, and even then, there's probably been some changes. But you know, local government is absolutely struggling. I mean, 40% of budgets in 2010. And as Aishagul says, I mean, the statutory services obviously have to keep going. You know, we have to collect bins, we have to look after children, we have to look after adults. And even then, the money's not enough. So even if I go back sort of 15 years, yes, you had structures like that, you know, representative committees. You also had whole teams set up in children's services that dealt with certain community groups. This was in Haringey. They don't exist. The money isn't there. When the money was cut, I mean, they were, you know, the areas we had youth services disappeared, you know. And so it's, you know, the message has been, oh, well, the luxury is not there. And I think it's not a luxury, it's a necessity. But if you've got 40% of your budget cut, what do? You protect adults, you protect children, you know, and you collect bins, you know, and that's the reality. So the political will just hasn't been there by the Conservative government since 2010. The various Conservative governments, they haven't got the will to carry on. That's the issue.
I think
Yes, they'd much rather give tax perks to the super rich.
Yeah.
And then they
Even
wonder why we've got knife crime.
So
Because there's nothing for the kids to do.
yeah. All right,
Ertanc,
Filiz. Yeah.
can I touch back about legislation and Inequalities Act? It's not enough that we have an Equalities Act, because there's sexist injustice within most of our legislation anyway. So if you look at the Children Act, the focus is very much on a mother's role, so a female role. If you look at anything about sexual offences, it's all about how the female presents herself. So when the police are deciding what goes forward to the CPS, they do a little scoring sheet, and some of it is about the attitude and the behaviour of that woman in regards to that, and that will impact it whether it goes to the CPS. If it ever gets to court again, it's not just institutional, it's social perceptions of women and their behaviour that also impacts on what would happen in that prosecution. And that cuts right across from child sexual exploitation, child criminal exploitation, child sexual abuse cases. It's a ridiculous what would happen in regards to that. And okay, it's not all girls or young women that get affected or women that get affected by that, but they are the majority of those victims. Same with domestic violence. If a woman is a victim of domestic violence, she has to up sticks with her children. She has to move her children from school, from the area they know, away from their family, to be safe. So they're safe, so kind of safe physically, but they're not safe mentally, emotionally. They don't get their community support anymore. They're away from the services that they know as well for the children. So it's not just about the Equalities Act, it's about all our other legislation and procedures in place for women as well.
Yeah, procedures and practices. So in terms of structural sexism, it's still very much alive in local authorities. Sorry, Aisha,
can we just expand on, because you know, I'm very grateful to Filiz, because I was hoping we would actually cover the issue of domestic violence. The fact that ever since about the mid-90s, resources have been cut. So even though the legislation enabled the police to take a more active role from about 1990 onwards with regard to the police prosecuting the male partners on grounds of you know, of domestic violence, resources have been reduced, and we have a situation now, according to statistics in 2019, where 1 in 5 deaths in London was a woman by her partner or by another member of the family. It was basically domestic violence. And of course, with COVID and social, you know, the lockdown, the numbers of women and numbers of deaths have increased, but the resources have a far less. While demand has increased, provision has decreased.
Yeah, and that the highest impact we've seen is in our no recourse to public fund. I hate calling people no recourse to public funds because they're people, but anyway, that's the title they give them. But the highest impact is on those women, because they can't access. It takes ages to get the Home Office judgment, and they're usually here on spousal visas, and so that's who it's impacted the most in regards to the domestic violence incidences during COVID as well.
Okay, if I can ask July to connect Fevzi, because I'd really like him to be involved in the next issue I want to raise, and that is about the role of men in tackling sexism. For example, 3 men, including myself, were invited as guest speakers at the Limasollular Derneği's International Women's Day event a few years ago. No, I thought it was really important.
Classic.
they invited men to talk about women's International Women's Day, because it's us.
Did they invite any women?
Most of the audience were women. So,
But any of the speakers, were they women?
No, the chair
Doesn't
was
sound like it.
the chair was a woman. But I think
Thank God.
there is a really important issue here, Aisha, because we men are the perpetrators, aren't we? In terms of sexist behavior comes from men. So what they thought would do is to invite men to hear their views and also to include them in the fight against sexism, which I think whenever I write on the International Women's Day a column about this, I'm criticized. There are some women say this is our day. We do how we organize, which is fine. Exactly, I agree with that. But there are some women who categorically exclude men in the fight against sexism, and we obviously have a big role in that. Don't you agree?
Yeah, as perpetrators, definitely.
Yeah, but the perpetrators have to be educated and
Exactly.
taken on board and
I agree.
challenged, aren't they? We must
yeah,
be challenged
definitely.
when we.
That's right.
Don't you agree?
Women need to be educated at times, because sometimes I hate to say some of the, I don't know if you could call it sexism, but some of the behaviours I've experienced from other women at times hasn't been very good either. So, but you're right. I think on the specific topic, men have to be part of the conversation, and they can be allies, absolutely, to the cause. You know?
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you are tackling race equality and say that white people have no place in this, it's like that, isn't it? It's a parallel to that.
Well, it depends. There's a space. There's a you can say they should be part of the conversation, but as long as there's a safe space for women to talk, and as long as that that's allowed, and that men are not trying to speak on their behalf, I think that's the key here. Being an ally is one thing, but women should be allowed to express their issues and their feelings uninterrupted and without being kind of told what to. The same with race,
Absolutely. So, in fact, at that event, when I was speaking, I mentioned the Turkish newspapers. There are adverts about the saunas, and the Turkish newspapers there didn't like it at all. I was attacked, and it was a woman who said that the papers need income. Where are they going to get their income? I was appalled. It was absolutely appalling for a woman to support the newspaper for using those images of women in their papers. It was absolutely disgusting, I thought.
Look, women can collude. They can collude as well.
Sorry, Peray.
No, I was just going to say women can collude with sexism, and that's the issue. That's why it is important to educate our young women. Absolutely, and generations we have to educate, because collusion does happen. People have become kind of embarrassed to say, I'm a feminist, I want equality. It's all a bit embarrassing. It's all a bit 80s. It's not cool. We're going to put on our full eyelash, and it's like there's a sort of clash between looking a certain way and being a feminist, and actually that's not true.
Doesn't need to be.
Yeah, exactly. So there is collusion, unfortunately, but
it's also to raise our sons as well, be it whether you're a father or a mother or an uncle or an auntie. It's important to have that awareness with the boys in the family as well, and I think that's that's a different one. Yeah, that's the bigger challenge.
The attack on women for that. Some people blame women for raising boys to be sexist in future, and they are mercilessly attacked in some societies, including Turkey, for example. There is a lot of that going on. Women are blamed for raising the sexists of the future, but a woman who has no economic independence in a place like Turkey, what choice does she have to, withstand the community's reactions and so on? I think that's quite difficult for women to, act against the norm.
Well, it's putting your head above the parapet, isn't it? It's how much we can challenge. We don't have to go to Turkey. We can go to Cyprus.
And I also think that's also a class difference as well, because I think you may find it different in different arenas of Turkey as well, in different families. I don't think it's across the board. Same as in the UK. I think you would find it very different.
Yeah, I think it is a bit unfair to show one country as an example. It happens everywhere. It's not just in Turkey, but I showed it as an example. So,
well, I have a very interesting anecdote about that, because I remember when I was about 10 or 11, there was a family that we used to visit, and I suppose you could classify them as sort of more middle class, Turkish Cypriot family with 6 sons. The boys did all the housework and the mother just looked fabulous and received guests. So, there are some positive. I know some of my friends, their sons do the cooking. Those that are married, they really take sort of 50-50 responsibility with regard to their children and doing things for their children. So I think things are changing. But,
my husband is currently with the baby next door.
But the thing is, it's noticed, isn't it? It's commented on. It's remembered. You've remembered it. If she'd had 6 daughters, you wouldn't have remembered that. So that's the difference. We need to get to a point where we don't have to remember it, where we don't have to think this is unusual. That should be the norm.
Well, quite exactly. I just chipped in. I've just had a baby. She's 2 months old, and my husband is, it's 50-50. He's, as I said, he's next door now. So if you hear a scream, that's what it is. It's commented on. We're both new parents, and whereas people say, "Oh my God, he's wonderful. He's such a great dad," and he is. He absolutely is. But the way people come on it, it's as if, "Oh my God, it's so unusual." He's just a Cypriot.
Well, it was like my ex-partner now. He looked after our son for a year. He was a stay-at-home dad. I had my son for a year during my maternity period. I never got the neighbours looked after the baby while he went home to get a shower. They delivered him food. They did, they couldn't do enough for him because they thought, poor him. But whereas when it was me struggling, couldn't get dressed some days, it was, it wasn't poor me. That was kind of, I should be more organised. But so that there's still that difference.
Yeah. Fevzi is waiting in the background, so if we can introduce him as well. And perhaps he can also comment on the role of men in fighting sexism as well. Hi, Fevzi.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, how are you, Fevzi? You okay?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, we are having a heated discussion. I don't know if you've been listening to the discussions in the background.
Yeah, I caught some of it.
Okay, where we are now is about the role of men in fighting sexism. And I gave an example of me and 3 other men being invited to a International Women's Day event of an organization, and they all laughed at me, Fevzi. So what do you think about the role of men in fighting sexism? Forget about your hat as a union rep. As a man, how do you think we should be involved in challenging sexism?
Well, I think it's hard to forget about my hat, because that's what's conditioned me because of the many years that I've been a trade unionist. So I think like a trade unionist, even when I'm not a trade unionist. I think I agree with Peray that, you know, I think safe spaces are really important.
Sure.
And I think there are some organisations have women's events. I mean, you talk about International Women's Day. I think clearly there's a lot of men who need a lot of educating when it comes to issues around sexism and the complete lack of respect that some men show towards women, you know, in the workplace, in wider society, even in you know, in political spheres as well. So, I mean, I'm probably as feminist as you're going to get a man. So I'm quite biased in my views, and I'm proud to have those views, because I do think women get an incredibly harsh deal, and workplaces aren't set up generally to support them, and that's why you've got issues with the gender pay gap and you know, stuff like that. So we do need to do a lot more to help women in society to become more equal. You talked about, interestingly, you talked about the equality commissions previously.
Yeah.
The whole enforcement area, when the Equal Opportunities Commission was in place, which was the single strand that was doing enforcement issues around gender, you would hear about reports, various reports, specialist reports that they were doing, investigations that they had launched. And it's not a criticism of the Single Equality Commission, just a fact of reality. And I think your guests have touched on it. The year-on-year slashes to their funding has left them almost without any power, if I'm being brutally honest. And we do need enforcement across society, because there's a lot of things that go on and a lot of employers that need to be held
responsible. But in terms of enforcement, I mean, how far do the councils, for example, I must say in councils, because two of you work for the councils. Well, Peray is a councillor and Filiz is a senior council officer. When there is a complaint about homophobia and sexism, I think your dog is a bit hungry.
Sorry.
Oh,
Not my my youngest dog.
Oh, I thought it was Fevzi's, because it started barking when Fevzi came on. I was saying, how far are the local authorities, for example, take on board in challenge when there is a complaint about homophobia and sexism? How far do they actually take that on board and deal with the complaints?
Well, I think, bearing in mind, because I'm a trade union rep in local government, actually. So I think, you know, so obviously I deal with the workforce, but obviously you're talking about external complaints as well. I think so councils still have teams that deal with these issues, you know, hate crime, etc. I think the issue is it's knowing, but the police have got a role to play as well. So when you say homophobia, if it's a homophobic attack, like a physical attack, that's a role for the police to play, but councils have roles, whether it's, you know, through licensing, that type of thing. But the difficulty is when you say sexism, it's proving it, isn't it? You know, I have cases at work, I'm sure Fevzi comes across this as well in his role, where people come and say, I know I'm being discriminated against, you know, and you're just like, okay, but how do we prove this? So, you know, if it's going to the extreme, absolutely the police are involved, councils will be involved, it'll be looked into, etc. But if it's that more subtle, indirect type of discrimination, you don't stand a chance in hell. So I think it's taken seriously, and I'm pretty sure, I probably shouldn't say, but I'm sure it's taken more seriously by some councils than others, depending perhaps on their political makeup. Perhaps a bit naughty of me to say, I'm sure that's not entirely true, but it's, you know, to an extent it would be different for different councils. But, you know, it is taken seriously, but whether you've got the resource to deal with it, whether it's a subtle or not so subtle type of discrimination, I think it's all relevant, really. And as I said, I see it in the workplace all the time. You know, I see women come to me going, oh my God, I'm sure there's an issue here. This person spoke to me like this, trying to prove it, trying to get a case. You know, it's hard. It's very hard, you know.
Well, I think that very often it's not the councillors, but it's the senior officers who are mostly men, heterosexual men, who are guilty of not taking the issues forward in terms of when someone complains about homophobia or sexism. I think the way they deal, or racism, the way they deal with it is not very satisfactory. It's basically paying it lip service. I think I worked in local authority for 30 years, and I've come across many examples of sort of people paying lip service to these issues, but not actually dealing with them. And I work with both Labour and Lib Dem local authorities as well. So I don't know. What about you, Filiz? How is it dealt with in Newham? Oh, should I not say
doesn't matter. I think the difference is that it goes back to what Peray says. It's about the onus of proof, whichever the discrimination, because everything people, it's that subtle, covert discrimination that you're not going to be able to evidence fully. It's the he said, she said scenario, or she said, he said scenario. So it's more about how you're treated because you are of that gender or of that cultural background, rather than a direct attack towards you. And I think that's really difficult to evidence and put together in that respect. And that, I mean, I think linked into that is ageism as well. In I think how older women are treated in the workforce, speaking as one now, but it's really different. I've seen a marked difference in my experiences when you're not seen that you should be on that career ladder anymore as well. That's a big difference. So I think if you wanted to do something about it, you have to collate things gradually. And that's a lot of effort. And speaking to my union rep, what she says to me is that people give up at the first hurdles because it's so stressful. It is so stressful to do it that you just can't. You just want to kind of smooth it over. They offer you mediation of some kind, and then we move on. The thing about policies and procedures in local authorities, there's no time scales to grievances. They try not to call them grievances; they call them resolution procedures. And
there are time scales. There are time scales for this. If you want to go to a tribunal, there's a time scale. It's 3 months. Your authority might not deal with it, but you've got 3 months.
Yeah, you've got that 3 months. But if they've already trying to evidence that they're doing it and they're dealing with it, they just leave you hanging there in that way, don't they? So I think they can manipulate, because a lot of people won't. So a lot of people won't want to go towards a tribunal. A lot of my experience of unions is they don't actually encourage it either. So I think they want to work with your employer to develop, to resolve it at work, in the workplace, because ultimately you want to still be working there. More often than not, you still want to be in a job. So that's different. I think it's a real challenge for people to it's seen as antagonistic, maybe it's seen as adversarial, and it's a difficult period for people. And people just try and not get into that, don't they? They try to think so I think it's really difficult for people that just want to go into work, do their job, do the best they can for the whatever community they serve, and come home again. I don't think it's that easy.
Fevzi, you wanted to say something?
Come in here, Ertanc.
Fevzi wanted to come in, I think, before.
Yeah,
Did you want to respond to Filiz?
I think on ETs and grievances, sadly, I don't think unions have processes in terms of how they assess these cases. I know both CW and GMB have a similar process in terms of looking at prospects of success. You can't just take on every single case, but we know, and I think someone touched on it around the overt way that these that sexism often manifests itself, is very difficult to prove. And a lot of these bullies, a lot of these misogynists, they hide behind these procedures. And if there's a woman who's brave enough to challenge a bully who's been, harassing her, and being sexist towards her, often it's one person's word against another. So that brave woman will put her head above the parapet to try to challenge this behavior. And then when it's one person's word against the other, invariably, the complaint won't be upheld. And then the individual finds themselves on the end of a conduct procedure themselves, whereby there's an alleged a malicious or vexatious case that's been made. So, and it's similar to, you translate that to our judiciary and how many cases of, rape go through to prosecution, how women are so, how the system discourages women from going forward to these procedures. And even when, there's women who make their allegations known sometimes after years because they've been so scared. And the first question they get asked is, why did you wait 10 years to say something? It's our system, our society is set up to just put barrier after barrier in front of women, and we've got to smash those barriers and make these scenarios a lot easier for women to come forward.
Yeah, Aisha.
I just wanted to say that during my time with Haringey Council, I was involved in sort of initiating a working group which finally produced a policy on sexism, sex discrimination, and sexual harassment. And I was also involved in supporting and advising women. And we actually we had, I can think of at least 3 or 4 instances where the male managers were actually sacked. What I wanted to say is that it's a pattern of behavior, and from my personal experience, it doesn't always just affect one woman. I remember, having a group of 3 or 4 women who came to see me. And what I said to them is solidarity. You've got to work together. If you want to resolve this without going through disciplinary procedures, the 4 of you or 5 of you need to sit down with your manager and actually say, this is what you've been doing, or this is what we've been experiencing. Actually, that's better to do it assertively. It's better to talk about your feelings and how you felt and how you perceived it. Because otherwise, if you say you did this and you did that and you did the other person will get very defensive. But it is often a pattern of behavior. And what happens is, in the first instance, what someone said, some women have put up with it for 10 years. Well, what happens is it escalates. It might start as a little bit of sort of innuendo and in inverted commas, banter. Well, I'm sorry, but it's only banter if the other person is laughing. If the other person is not laughing, it isn't banter. It's very personal to them, whether it's racism or sexism. It often starts with a little bit of banter, and then, it might be, oh, I do like that outfit on you, etc., etc. And in the end, it could involve touching or pinching or whatever. So it is very important, for any woman that's might be watching, talk to other women, find a woman that will listen to you and perhaps support you, whether it's a friend, whether it's someone outside of the organization, whether it's someone that works for a citizens advice bureau, and use your diary and record every little thing, because each thing on its own may not seem major, but the accumulative effect will show a pattern of behavior which often escalates. And if there's 3 or 4 of you who have experienced sexism or discrimination in your workplace, you need to tackle it collectively, because then you will empower each other, and there is strength in numbers, and more importantly, you are more likely to be believed because it acts as corroborating evidence. Often where cases fall down is that there isn't sufficient corroborating evidence. However, if it's more than one woman who has experienced discrimination or made to feel uncomfortable in any way, when there's 2 or 3 of you, it's not so easy for people to disbelieve you.
I don't know about you, but I get some interference in my earphones. Do you hear that as well?
Yeah, I'm hearing it.
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
I'm not hearing it. I'm fine.
It's when, yeah.
I think perhaps it's one of your earphones, or even mine, maybe. Anyway, let's read a few comments. One of them is from Fevzi. What are you doing sending?
That was before I
He's already said this anyway, so I wondered. Mehtap Aytu, tanıdığım en deneyimli, entelektüel donanımlı Kıbrıslı Türk bayan, geçmişte Türk toplumuna sayısız faydaları dokunmuştur. Bu gece Ayşegül Hanım'ı gördüğüme çok memnun oldum. Teşekkürler organize eden ve etkililere. Evet, Ayşegül'ün a fan of yours, Ayşe.
Yes, thank you, Mehtap.
Lovely.
Abi Hussein is saying, right, how about mentioning how Thatcher came in? Abi is a very avid listener of our, viewer of our programs. I think he's got another one. Socialists blaming the Conservative Party for knife crime in Haringey. In 70s, Islington were known as Banana Republic, and how Haringey is not, and now Haringey is not far behind. I'm sure you want to...
That in itself, that terminology in itself,
the causes of knife crime are multifaceted, and a lot of it is about resources for young people, and also the lack of protection for our young people, and criminalising young people when actually they're the exploited ones.
You mentioned Haringey in a rather derogatory term. I mean, just to say, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what's meant there. I mean, it's not socialist blaming anyone. It's fact. You know, since 2010, youth services have been slashed to the core. Okay, that's not. You know, I'm not just saying that because I'm a Labour councillor. That's a fact. Go and look up the facts. Youth services, youth clubs were closed everywhere, you know. And if we don't think that that's somehow linked to what's now going on with the knife and gun crime with young people, then I'm sorry, you need to go and wake up. And please, using terms like Banana Republic. Let's give it a miss, please.
We'll do that. We'll do that. Yasemin Brett, our friend Yasemin,
my councillor,
councillor from Enfield, is saying, hi, all delighted to see Ertanc, Ayşegül and Peray, all known to me. Very important issues. Bullying on the rise everywhere at the moment, at every level, by women, on women too. Okay, we've already tackled that issue, didn't we? Women on women, sexism and bullying and so on. Abi was saying, you are blaming the Tory party. Abi is obviously a Tory party member.
Obviously.
Okay, obviously.
Well, there has to be some, obviously.
Yeah, that's fine.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have got into power.
No.
But the fact is that where the Labour Party councils are a lot more in tune with these issues than the Tory councils. That's a fact as well, Abi. Okay, so now the other question is, where are we? Okay, in our community, in our Turkish-speaking, Turkish Cypriot community, call it what you want. What are the issues within our communities? And it's like asking how how long is a string? What are these issues in our community? There are so many issues of these kind of things in our community. Homophobia, racism, sexism. We have dealt with a lot of the issues around racism and in depth. So in terms of homophobia and sexism, I know we all experience issues from our own community. I remember one meeting I took Peray with me at the consortium. I don't know if she wants to talk about it, but there are a lot of issues in our community around these issues. So who wants to start? And also, it's not just good enough to talk about these issues, but as members of these communities, as individuals, as members of community organizations, what are we going to do about this?
Well, can I dive in? So
Yeah,
I guess I mean what's really important about that question is of course, you know, as a collective, as Turkish speakers, as Turkish Cypriots, we experience discrimination more generally from the population here who are in a position to impose it. However, as women and as a Turkish Cypriot woman, then you've got the double dilemma of actually facing that discrimination from men within your own community, from when you're growing up, you know, within your own family, etc. So you're fighting the patriarchy within, conscious that the men within your family are also facing that discrimination. So whereas, you know, my dad, God rest his soul, you know, certainly had certain expectations of me as a woman, then my dad used to have to go out to his shop in East Ham and, you know, get it smashed to pieces every weekend by a bunch of racists. So it's always that double dilemma for us women as well. So you're tackling patriarchy within and patriarchy externally, whilst conscious that the men that we're dealing with are also facing these issues too. So I'd say it's a complicated picture here because, as I said, there's the family issues and there's the ones that have an impact on you because they set out your opportunities and what's expected and what isn't of you. However, in wider society, it's not Turkish Cypriot men that are preventing me doing anything if there is anything I want to do. It's often the wider structures of British society. So it's complex, and you know, I think there are things that have to be recognised. But I'm sure us women and Febs, you know, we can go on for hours about the types of discrimination women face within the Turkish Cypriot community. And I think, if I remember rightly, that event you recall, Ertanc, was that when I got told off for not speaking Turkish? I can't remember. I genuinely.
That's the one. Yeah. I mean, you were quite young then, and the way that person, it wasn't just that you were young and you were speaking in Turkish. The fact that because you were a woman as well, the disrespectful way he spoke to you was really, well, I mean, he's not the only one. So let's say. Look
at it now. I mean, it's if you say, you know, even on these various Facebook groups that have cropped up everywhere, Turkish Cypriot this, Turkish Cypriot that, and you know, so the attacks. It's like you're a Labour councillor, and you can see that sometimes there's an underlying thing of, you know, you're in politics, you're a woman, you should know your place, kind of thing, and you know, just having had a baby as well, it's I'm certainly being told to know my place even more than ever now. So. Maybe one day I will. I don't know.
No, don't ever do that.
Unlikely.
Okay. What about you three? What do you think about the community issues? That eternal question, the community issues. What? Silence? I can't believe it.
Okay. I mean, I think that as a community, we're making progress. You see that with our youngsters. You look at LGBT plus phobia issues, that is still very prominent. It's prominent across society. You look at stats. I think there was a report by Stonewall, and issues around depression, anxiety, mental health issues are so staggeringly high within that community, and even more so when you bring in the Black, Asian, and ethnic minority dynamic, to which our youngsters and you know, people not so young who are out or who aren't out. You know, I think we need to acknowledge Ertanc. You know, I'm proud that I've got a number of LGBT plus family members, and you know, but there's a number of people in our community who have bravely come out in the most awful circumstances, and you know, the to the point where, let's be blunt, some people in our community have been disowned by their family. And you know, that really shows how we view issues around same-sex relationships. Even today in 2020, there's 72 countries that criminalize same-sex relationships. 72 countries. There's 11 countries that still have the death penalty for same-sex relationships. For God's sake, I mean, you know, it's just a matter of someone loving another person. The fact that they're from the same sex should be absolutely irrelevant. I saw a brilliant poster that Stonewall did, and it's a big letters. It says, "I'm gay, get over it." You know, it's really not a big deal if someone's gay, right, or trans or whatever. And there's too many people who are unfortunately, you know, have views whereby they see these people as a lesser human being or something wrong with them. And I tell you what, for people watching this and for people who are going to watch it in future, if there's anything wrong with anyone, it's wrong with the people who have these types of views, because you need to come into the 21st century and start respecting everyone with dignity and respect that everyone deserves, irrespective of what their beliefs and sexual orientation is.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Fawzi. Aisha and Filiz?
Yeah, well, I just want to say my my mic was muted earlier, so it could be that Filiz couldn't come in because hers was muted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Frankly,
right
I
now.
don't really have a
don't hear.
problem. I don't have a problem with who people choose to sleep with. I never have had. You know, I remember my first weekend at university, freshers weekend, and there were two women kissing, and I didn't, you know, it just didn't affect me in any way. You know, it just seemed natural and so forth. I think when you've grown up in a community where certainly when we were much younger, there were still many sort of young women that were having arranged marriages. And if you are someone who is appalled by the idea of people having to have sex with someone that is not of their choosing, then I think you should be sympathetic, empathic, and understanding with anyone who makes a particular choice, whether they choose to sleep with a woman or a man, as long as it's consensual and as long as there is no abuse. The thing I have a problem with is paedophilia, because there we are talking about abuse and exploitation. Let's go back to the issue of the community. I think it's quite an interesting situation that we have, because if you think back to our parents' generation, probably the most popular singer was Zeki Müren, and he is someone who was known to be gay. We also have Bülent Ersoy, you know, another diva of the music industry, transsexual, and several other singers whose names I can't think of. And we also had Huysuzvyujun, who died yesterday, I believe, who was a drag artist who was on television every week, you know, a comedian and so forth. So it's always been there, you know, I mean, in the 50s or whatever, you know, there were, but I suppose it was whispers, because many gay men did actually marry, but they might have had discreet relationships, etc. So it's always been there. It's nothing new. Some people behave as if this is something new, but it's, you know, it goes back centuries and centuries and centuries. So I think get over it. And, you know, we're all human beings. The issue is not about who you choose to sleep with. It's about how decent, how caring, how accepting, how giving you are as a human being. And as I say, as long as, you know, it's two consenting adults, it shouldn't affect or, you know, it isn't anyone's, it's, you know, it's other people shouldn't be judgmental. Really, but I mean, I actually know quite a few young gay people, well, not so young now, who've been out to their families for many, many years. I mean, in the 1980s, we had Cypriot Gay and Lesbian group, and quite a few of our colleagues from sort of North London boroughs or South London boroughs who we knew through their roles within local government or within the voluntary sector were members. Some of them we knew, but because they hadn't actually come out to us, we were sort of discreet until they sort of have told us. But you know, I'm really happy to see that the families, and some of these families were very strict families. I would not have expected them to be accepting. But I think there's also, because there are sort of more people out in the community, I think they're also better able to support each other. And I'd like to think that sort of second generation and third generation parents will, you know, encourage and support their children's choices, you know, provided that they don't hurt anyone.
Yeah.
And in Cyprus as well. I mean, I know, I have friends who I know are sort of, I know more gay people than, I don't know any lesbians in Cyprus, but I do have friends who are gay. One is a university lecturer, the other one is a teacher. And you know, there are others that I've sort of seen, and my gaydar suggests that they're gay, you know. And I think there is quite a community in Cyprus. They may not all be sort of Turkish Cypriot or Greek Cypriot, but you know, the thing is that, you know, with Turkey becoming more religious, there, you know, there might be more, you know, sort of more issues there. But you know, because I sort of knew sort of artists and singers in Turkey, I did know people who were gay and known to be gay as well. And you know, we sort of go listen to music together, you know, have a drink, converse, you know.
I think it's a pity
I just don't know how they've been impacted with the changes brought about by the current administration in Turkey.
Yeah, it's a pity that the organization you mentioned, I'm not sure, are they are not around anymore, are they?
No.
Aisha?
So
they're not.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, obviously,
not.
You know, they're sort of all mature adults now, but I don't know if, you know, there is a similar organization.
Okay, I think Filiz is saying they are not.
Yeah, I don't think they still are. Okay. And then we also had the Cypriot HIV/AIDS network as well.
Right, yes,
but that was around as well, and used to have lots of social events, etc., to educate all of us actually. But I think it's very easy for us to say that there's lots more tolerance around, and that people are more open, because for every one person that's open, there's probably about another 5 that aren't. And I think that's the ones.
Oh, of course.
They're the people that we need to think about supporting.
Absolutely.
We need to think about. In my work, I worked in HIV and AIDS in Istanbul as well as in London, and it was tragic, the amount of young men married in marriages because they were not able to be open about their sexuality. And that was both in London and in Istanbul as well. So as much as that might have reduced, I think that still exists, because tolerance isn't as much as we'd want it to be.
I think support groups like that are really important. Their role is crucial, because there are quite a lot of women's group, very effective women's group, giving support to women on domestic violence issues, on other issues. But if there aren't any LGBT group in the community, it's a pity, perhaps. Sorry, Fevzi, yeah, go on.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I just want to touch on something that Aisha Hanum said. I'm not sure what the reference to paedophilia was meant in what context, because we're having a debate about homophobia. But I just wanted to make that clear for people listening. That there are support groups there, because I remember when I was doing our drive time radio show with Canan Nouri, we would every week make sure we were talking about LGBT issues. And this is back in 2010, 2011. And I know that there was a Turkish block at Pride, at London Pride, and it was the first time that a Turkish group that I'm aware of marched with the Pride marches. And I remember that day really well. I mean, I regularly go to Pride marches, and you could see how kind of almost like how free they felt, that they were free to express their sexuality. They weren't being judged by our community. They were amongst, friends. They were, the majority of people there were out, and there were some that obviously weren't out, and then, lots and lots of allies as well. And it's such a beautiful day. And I think that group is still going, and it's on Facebook, although it might not be particularly active. But you're right. I think our youngsters need to be, we need to make sure that there are support groups in place. If it's not going to be kind of a bespoke community group, there are lots of other LGBT plus groups that are about that will offer great support.
But the thing about
I was just
trying to say about support groups, because they're so under-resourced, and it's mainly based on kind of goodwill and volunteers, is the outreach to young people that would need that support. The ones that need the support often don't get the support because the outreach isn't out there for them. Yeah.
Aisha, would you like to respond to Fevzi about your comments? About
what about paedophilia?
The context.
Well, basically, child abuse is an issue of great concern to me. A couple of weeks ago, I came across this video on YouTube accidentally. And it was this woman, Turkish woman, Turkiyeli woman. I don't know whether she was a parliamentarian or who the hell she was. And she was saying that it's acceptable for a 60-year-old to marry a 12-year-old if that 12-year-old is okay with it. I can't think of any 12-year-old girl that would be okay with marrying a 60-year-old. And she was, saying that it's okay in the Quran, which I'm sure it isn't. So, I mean, that is an issue that I feel quite, passionate about, because there are certain intellectuals now that are actually arguing that paedophilia is another sexuality, which I personally find that very offensive. And again, this is a video I happened to see on YouTube, and they were two women academics, but as I said, what two consenting adults do shouldn't concern anyone. It should only be an issue where there is abuse, and often the abuse is heterosexual abuse. So yeah, that is something I feel quite passionately about, and there is not very much being done with regard to child abuse within the Turkish, Kurdish, and Cypriot communities.
I think the fact that pedophilia and pedophilia came up during the discussion about homophobia. That was the troubling thing, I think.
Oh, I wasn't linking the two at all. No. What I was saying was, I don't have a problem. I don't think it's unnatural if people, people say that we're created in God's image, the religious people. Okay, well, if God created people who are lesbian, people who are gay, people who feel trapped in a particular body and, want to transgender. There is also now people who are classify themselves as intersex, people who classify themselves as third gender, and others who, so in terms of their sexuality, say they are non-binary. Now, there are different cultures who actually see gender, they consider there are 4 or 5 genders as well. So I think the debate is becoming much wider now. I mean, I was, when I sort of first heard the term third gender, I thought, well, is this a term for hermaphrodites? I didn't know. I had to look it up on Google. But then what I discovered was that actually the modern term, the term hermaphrodite isn't used so much now. The modern term is intersex. Basically, people that have genitalia of both sexes. And of course, there are numerous issues there, because in the past, surgeons actually would operate on children, and later, when they were adults, they would be very unhappy with the gender that had been imposed on them. And Malta actually brought out legislation on this in 2015, which I believe was adopted by the EU. So you have to wait until a child is the age of consent for them to decide, their own gender and whether they choose to have surgery. So, so the debate is becoming wider and wider.
Okay, Peray, you wanted to say something?
Well, it's almost past it now, but it was just to sort of advise caution, similar to what Fev said, that Aishagul, I know you didn't mean it, but I guess there is that old trope about linking pedophilia with gay men, and I think that's, in that sense, I think like Fevzi, I sort of went, what does that mean? I appreciate that's not what you meant, but I guess it is a trope. Be careful.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of male rape is that, like, for instance, in prisons. I mean, I actually appeared on a television program about this many years ago, Kilroy Silk program, and basically, male rape is often in prisons. It's often heterosexual men who rape other men. But no, I wasn't thinking. All I was saying is the only thing I have a problem with is child abuse.
Yeah.
And that is more common in heterosexual society.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've touched on quite a number of issues, and I think in tackling both racism, sexism, of course, racism as well, and homophobia, the role of the parents, teachers, and unions are obviously very important. So in the last 20 minutes or so, if we can have a look at these issues, what are the roles? What are the unions doing? What are the teaching unions are doing in terms of not just the unions, but teachers themselves are doing, the parents, what should parents do? I mean, parents have got a very obviously very important role. And if we can deal with this. But firstly, I've sort of looked up and found quite a few statistics. You all know there was even in Parliament where these laws are passed, there is a big problem about sexual harassment in Parliament itself. There was an inquiry in 2019, and just something from there. The Inter-Parliamentary Union's brief, Sexism, Harassment and Violence Against Women in Parliaments in Europe, is not just here, showed that 47% of the female MPs that took part in this study that received death threats of rape or beating, 58% had been the target of online sexist attacks on social networks, 68% had been the target of comments relating to their physical appearance or on social networks based on gender stereotypes, and a staggering 25% had suffered sexual violence. This is amazing,
Wow.
appalling statistics, aren't they? That's really amazing. And not just in this country, but in Europe. And just a couple of other statistics in schools. Less than a quarter, 22% of female students at mixed-sex schools think their school takes sexism seriously enough. Only 22%, less than 22%. 78% of secondary school students are unsure or not aware of the existence of any policies and practices in their schools relating to preventing sexism. Over half, 64% of secondary school teachers are unsure or not aware of the existence of any policies and practices in their schools related to preventing sexism. These are really staggering statistics, aren't they? So let's start with your areas, Fevzi and Peray. The unions, they haven't exactly been role models in terms of tackling both issues, sexism and sexism, racism, and homophobia, actually. But I know that in your unions, things have moved on quite a lot. A lot of progress is being made. So would you like to tell us about some of those?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind, and obviously unions, like any big organisations, and they are huge. I mean, Unison has well over 1 million members nationally, so you'll get different practices in different branches, etc. And the policy which is made by our conference is absolutely brilliant on kind of sex equality, trans policies, etc. Unison is fantastic. However, what I will say is, without getting into all of that, because on paper, as I said, fantastic. The three main unions, which are GMB, Unite, Unison, currently all of their general secretaries are white men. All of them, all three. Now, all three are up for a change now. Dave Francis has just stepped down, Unison. GMB are going to go through a leadership change as well, and Unite as well. And that will be interesting to see, because, as I said, all three, not only men, but white men as well. So I think, it is about kind of setting the tone from the top. So, locally in my branch, I'll look at various things and sort of try and address these issues at very local level, but we have to set the tone from the top. And, the onus doesn't entirely fall on unions as well. I mean, unions deal with workplace discrimination, and there's other areas that need to be looked at on a day-to-day basis as well. So I think, keeping it simple, as I said, the three general secretaries are all white men, and I think that some noise has to be made. She's going to come in now as well, about how that changes, really. Unison is something like 80% women as a union, and black, so let's see what happens. But I'm going to kick off with that. It's all very well preaching and having the right policies, but you have to practice what you preach. I think that's the most important thing, really.
Absolutely. Fevzi?
Yeah, I don't disagree with a word that Peray said. I'm going to she may be bound by certain protocols in terms of not saying, mentioning any names. But you know, you're right. I think the GMB has had just white men general secretaries, and I think that's the same for the vast majority of trade unions. You know, our black workers, I use black in a political context, not in a colour context. Our black workers need role models. And I'm going to actually plug someone in Unison, a good friend of mine, who I know is also a good friend of Peray, a gentleman called Roger Mackenzie. When we talk about issues, when we talk about issues like racism, there is no one who is more passionate in terms of developing a collective bargaining issue that addresses race equality in the workplace. And you know, I think Roger will make an absolutely brilliant general secretary for Unison, and he will lead the way. He's got a fantastic profile. Clearly, there's going to be competition, but I believe Roger is going to lead the way for some of the other trade unions to begin to deal with these changes, these structural changes that are needed. But yeah, I thought I'd give you a plug there, Roger, if you're watching.
He's got my vote. He's got my vote.
He's got your vote as well.
He's got my vote.
And mine. Roger was a councillor as well, wasn't he?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there'll be loads of Turkish-speaking people that work in public authorities. So a huge number of them will be members of Unison. So we need to do what we can to help encourage change. But getting back to the kind of sexism and homophobia point, I just wanted to touch on the work that we need to do to develop these policies that make that will give better support to women, whether it's around domestic violence, whether it's around enhanced maternity pay and leave, whether it's around progressive flexible working, caring, addressing the gender pay gap. You know, for every pound a man earns, a woman currently earns 83 pence. And the current estimate is 60 years for the gender pay gap to close. I mean, those sort of stats are just not acceptable in this day and age. And if you're a disabled woman or a woman from a certain ethnic group where intersectionality comes in, those gaps are even greater. So I think that there's a massive push, like we've got to develop these policies and really make sure women are supported. Even if it, you know, there's something that we did in CW, which I'm personally very proud of, and that is looking at the issue of where women have premature babies, because currently the law only kicks in at 39 weeks in terms of the maternity leave and pay, I believe. And I think there's I know we've worked with a group, I think they're called Bliss, and there's other charities as well. And to be fair, Royal Mail have embraced the idea. And I think these are the types of progressive policies we've got to show women that we're leading the way, and we've got women's backs, you know, because imagine a woman having a premature baby. Babies are born at 20, 21, 22 weeks now. I know a lot of them don't survive, sadly, but a lot of them do. And that woman won't be able to go back to work. There'll be issues about their ability to bond with the baby, issues around their mental health. All of these issues, they need to be supported. So these are the policies we've got to tackle. So and it's the same across on homophobia and LGBT plus issues. Ertanc. We've got to develop a workplace where there's dignity and respect for everyone.
Sure. Filiz, you are disappearing into the
it's getting darker and darker here. Yeah.
Portuguese night.
Getting very darker and darker. I'm just curious. I'm a union member. I came into being a union member very late into my work, and that was basically because I started experiencing bullying and harassment at work. But I find the presence of unions in the workplace very low key compared to 10, 15 years ago. So I actually do question and struggle with how much influence can they have, how much can they help either on an individual or on a collective basis nowadays within a local authority, if I'm thinking about local authority? Because I do think it's really tough for the unions to have impact compared to what it might have been 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. At the risk of annoying Abby again, since Thatcher, the unions influence have unfortunately lessened. But I think obviously the role of unions are still vitally important, and we must, as members of our own community, we must try to encourage more and more people to join the unions. Actually, let me read a few more comments. Fulya Yahyaoğlu, our good friends, really good debate, great panelists. We need more intellectual discussions like this. There are a lot of issues in the community we need to tackle. Collectively, all well done all. Thanks, Fulya. Serap Kanay, another good friend. Hello all. Hi Ayşegül, good to see you. Internalized sexism is very important and need to be taken seriously and constantly addressed and challenged, just like racism and homophobia. Historically, women gets the double dose both within the community, family, and the British society as well. I believe homophobia is still big taboo and difficult subject to tackle for most within the Turkish-speaking community, or of course, class is an issue to consider here. Abi is saying culturally it will never be accepted. Attitude of Turkish community is it's okay as long as it's not my son or anyone from my family. Well, I think we agree with Abi here. Just there.
I think it's a bit of a generalization.
It is, yeah.
As I said, there are some very positive examples within our communities as well. And actually, what I feel about the Turkish Cypriot community, if I can just restrict myself to to that section rather than the broader Turkish-speaking communities, whether it's race or whether it's homophobia or any form of discrimination, people may have prejudices. But when it comes to dealing with individuals, they sort of interact, they might sort of have certain prejudices, but there is a certain level of acceptance of people if they are, considered to be, people with a sort of a nice personality, or they, sort of good conversation, or they're doing useful things within the community, or they're, professionals. So there is on that sort of one-to-one level, there I find that there is a certain acceptance, although when they're talking with others, they may use terminology which sort of indicates prejudice. So I don't think it's, I don't think that we're beyond the pale. There are some horrific experiences within the community at large. I mean, unfortunately, young gay men in particular still get beaten up. There is, there is sort of incidents of horrendous abuse here in America, other parts of Europe. So I don't think that our community is any worse. In fact, if anything, on the one-to-one level, people are probably a bit kinder.
Yeah. Okay. Yasemin Brett is saying, interestingly, homosexuality was decriminalized in the Ottoman Empire ahead of many Western countries in 1858. Our attitudes needs discussing, frankly. So happy you are taking this up. Thanks, Yasemin. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean,
I knew there were a couple of gay sultans, but I didn't know that the legislation was, to sort of decriminalise was, when you think that in the UK, I think homosexuality wasn't decriminalised until 1960, wasn't it?
I'm not sure.
I think it was around 1960.
Sure. Was it 60? Okay.
Yeah, but also I think Turkish women got the vote before most European women as well.
Yeah, I know,
so
but look at the position of women at the moment.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
That's really, it's neither here or nor there. If we look at the present situation of women.
And young girls, you know.
Absolutely,
because,
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I keep going on about child abuse is because they sort of decriminalized what I personally would categorize as pedophilia, which is the marriage of underage girls.
It's appalling. It's really appalling.
And that I think that is something that we might need to have a further debate on. And also the relationship of we sort of lump lesbians, gay men, bisexuals and transgender communities together, but they're not a homogenous group. In fact, I know that there are certain antagonisms between those groups. I mean, I know, when I was, I did a report when I was working in Haringey Council and almost got disciplined because I treated the subject very seriously and interviewed a group of lesbians and sort of looked at all the different departments individually and said what the issues were and what the needs were. And the newspapers picked it up. Next thing, the head of the director of social services gets onto my chair and says, this is outrageous, and where's the proof, and so on. And I got hauled in front of my line manager, who actually happened to be a gay man. He was the borough secretary at the time. So I don't know. I sort of went off on a bit of a tangent, but I know from conversations that I used to have with lesbians that they often felt that gay men were sexist. And I know that some lesbians weren't terribly fond of bisexuals, and some lesbians and gay men don't particularly like transgender. So it's, I think at some point in the future, the issues maybe need to teased out a bit more. But also, I think another very key issue within our communities that hasn't been discussed, but does go on, is child abuse. And it's something that Filiz, I'm sure, will have quite a lot of experience on. And maybe we need to look at, what support is available within the community for people to come back, to sort of come forward and have counselling or talk about maybe for the first time and get support, because that kind of childhood trauma doesn't go away and can impact later on in life as very severe depression or bipolar disorder, etc. So, I mean, there are some very key discussions that need to be had.
We've got a lot to discuss, a lot to do, but unfortunately, we've come to the end of our discussion for tonight. So if I can ask you to say your last few words, and then we can close. Shall I start with you, Filiz? Just sum up, just very brief, couple of minutes. Where do we go from here?
I think where we go from here is, I like the idea of thinking about support groups and thinking how we do the outreach and who's going to do that. It's about people taking responsibility. I think it's important to keep the conversation alive, but also that it's really important to value difference and value difference of opinions, as long as they're not oppressive, but also about not not categorizing people in groups.
Yeah.
Because I do think there's a real key. For me, in my job, I find myself a big role in involving fathers in regards to child protection work, because often they're often pushed aside or not counted, or actually we've done some amazing work with perpetrators of domestic violence as well, where their change is possible. So whether you're a perpetrator of sexism as well, I think change is possible, but we need that. Yeah, it goes back to the whole thing about resources and kind of staffing as well. Not just, it's about will, it's about people wanting to do it and wanting to create change as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Filiz. Peray?
Yeah, I think it's just to add to that, really. It's just about being bold and being challenging and never being afraid to question, really. And when we do get back, oh, but things are different, they're not like they were in the 70s or the 80s. Well, we still got far to go. And I think one of my biggest bugbears really is, even when we talk about racism, it's not racism that comes from your kind of skinheading Dr. Martens. It's the racism and the sexism that you experience institutionally, often from those who should know better. And I think that to me, it is one of the biggest issues. It's tackling institutional, structural sexism, racism, classism, etc. I mean, one thing what I will end on is, again, we've had a conversation about homophobia. I'm just conscious that I don't know everyone, but is anyone on this panel actually gay? And I think, that's the other thing, making sure that if we are going to have that conversation, having people who can speak to their experiences, really. I don't know if homophobia is any worse or better within our community, because I don't, it's not something I have experienced. I'm an ally, but I don't experience it. So I think we just have to be conscious about that as well.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Peray. Fauzi?
I guess, just a couple of key messages to finish off with. I always say this, Ertanc, when I come on your show, and that is to tell everyone watching to join a trade union. Because if I got £1 for every phone call that I had from people who found themselves in difficulty at work, I tell you what, their managers or colleagues would have thought twice about their behaviour if they were in a trade union. And they're likely to be in an environment where their pay and terms and conditions are significantly better. So obviously I'll plug the GMB and the CW, but obviously we have a Unison sister as well, so it's important I plug Unison. But I think there's, on homophobia, in my experience, I think that those who cry foul the loudest on homophobia are likely to have a skeleton or two in their own cupboards. Your viewers might not like hearing that, but those who make the loudest noise normally make those noises for a reason. But well done again to Eurogench and yourself in particular for hosting these, really important debates around. You've done the racism ones. Now we're tackling, or debating sexism and homophobia, and this is how we build greater awareness around these issues. So my thanks for that, and thank you for having me on your panel with your other guests.
Thank you, Fauzi. Thanks very much. Aisha?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I've sort of really enjoyed, the debate and discussion that we've had this evening, and meeting the other sort of panel guests. I think, yes, I very much want to put in a plug for people to join trade unions, because I think, it's very important in terms of holding employers to account, and also addressing the various isms as well. I very much like Filiz's idea of support groups. I think definitely we need to keep the conversations sort of going, and I'm a great believer in education. I think all of us on the panel and others that you've had on previous panels, we certainly, I'm sure, could sort of come together and discuss seminars or workshops that whether they're televised or whether we just do them, you know, more discreetly. These days, I tend to be more of an armchair activist. Due to certain sort of physical disabilities, but yeah, I'm certainly happy to you know, to support people. I don't know whether that's something that Eurogensch would be wishing to be involved with. You know, if people have some sort of specific questions, maybe you could identify persons who could be a first port of call, or just a listening ear, you know. I tend to prefer mainly text messaging, but you know, if someone really needs support, I'm sure we could have a telephone conversation. So yeah, I mean, I'm you know, I'm happy to contribute in whatever way is considered to be helpful.
Yes, I think one subject we haven't touched on tonight is if I raised it, we would have been here all night. And that's the community organizations from our own community. What have they been doing? What should they be? What should they have been doing? This is really important as well. And I know some are doing really good work, but we are lacking leadership and guidance for the whole community from our community organizations. We need to also discuss this issue as well. Yeah. Well, thanks.
Perhaps we could bring them together, Ertanc. You know, have a panel of people from the different community organizations and get them to talk about how they can contribute.
Well, if I can manage to get them around the same table, I'll
well, even if you've got 3 or 4.
Okay. So yes, that's something I really.
Febs is laughing.
Yeah, I know. That's something I really want to do, and I think, yeah, there will be people who will come around at the same table with some. Anyway, so the last comment is Reshma Zaman. Interesting topics. Thanks to the panel. Lots of food for thought. Thanks, Reshma. On these thoughts, I say many thanks to all of you. And good night.
Good night, Ertanc. Good night, all.
Bye.
Bye.
Look at the world we're living in today. Look at the broken communities. And if you know what Edible London represents, that's what we're here to do. Bring it all back together. So food growing and sharing food, that's what Edible London is about. This is what brings our communities back together. And sustainable food production is exactly what we aspire to do. The Edible London heroes are going through approximately 4 tons of surplus food a day. Once it's cleaned and sorted through, we're distributing it to our many partners across the capital. Approximately 50,000 people a week are being reached with the food we save. This is just the beginning. We're ready to scale this operation up big time. We just need your support. I just want people to actually see what's being created here, and not only to see, to become a part of it. We're asking for you to come and get involved, to help us keep feeding people. The problem of food poverty isn't going to go away. If anything, it's going to increase and become worse and worse and worse. In 12 weeks, we have almost reached 300,000 people with food. This is absolutely amazing. We are raising this 100k so we can keep this operation going, relocate and scale up. We are making it edible in any which way we can. We just need your support.